Pulp crazy. I wanted to make this video in a response to an interview that House of the Dragon showrunner and writer Ryan Condal gave to IGN a few weeks ago. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. During the interview, Condal indicates that Conan creator Robert E. Howard not only inspired George R.R. Martin, but also inspired J.R.R. Tolkien. Since then, I've heard fellow YouTubers repeat their own version of this statement. First things first, I'm not a Tolkien scholar by any means. I'm not even a Robert E. Howard scholar. I'm just a fan of both writers who knows where to find information. I'm here to tell you that I've been unable to find any evidence that Professor Tolkien was inspired by Robert E. Howard in any fashion. I'm going to lay out what I found in this video, and I encourage and invite all Tolkien scholars or fantasy scholars to chime in the comments or on your own website. As I said, I'm no expert. I just want to help keep this from going out of control. When creating this video, I used three primary sources: the timeline on the Tolkien Society website, and a book that is now out of print but you can get it on Amazon, The Collector's Index to Weird Tales by Sheldon Jaffrey and Fred Cook. I also used D.M. Ritzlin's article, Was Tolkien a Robert E. Howard Fan?, from his DMR Books website. I'm going to link to all three of those, as well as additional sources and links in the show notes. Now, right off the bat, let's just shoot down that Tolkien was inspired to create Middle-earth thanks to Robert E. Howard creating the Hyborian Age. Wikipedia indicates that Tolkien first began working on stories that would later become the Silmarillion in 1914. The timeline on the Tolkien Society's website also backs this up. Wikipedia cites The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, published by Houghton Mifflin in 1981 and edited by Humphrey Carpenter. Now, this book is the source of the notion that Tolkien was trying to create a mythology for England. There's been some pushback on that with more recent Tolkien scholarship. I stumbled upon an article by Luke Shelton where he indicates why calling Tolkien's work a mythology for England is wrong and misleading. I'm going to link to that in the show notes. But regardless if Tolkien was creating a mythology for England at the time or creating his own self-contained fantasy world, keep in mind Robert E. Howard would not even be published until July 1925, when Spear and Fang, his caveman story, first appeared in Weird Tales. Howard's first Lost Age sword and sorcery story, The Shadow Kingdom, featuring King Call, first appeared in the August 1929 issue of Weird Tales. And the first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, didn't appear until the December 1932 issue of Weird Tales. Howard's essay, The Hyborian Age, didn't appear until spring 1936, and it was in a fanzine edited and published by Donald A. Wollheim called The Fanograph. No matter how you look at this, to me, it appears that J.R.R. Tolkien was working on Middle-earth material and stories more than 1 decade before Robert E. Howard's The Shadow Kingdom was published in Weird Tales, and more than 2 decades before The Phoenix on the Sword, the first Conan story, was published in Weird Tales. So I don't think anyone in good conscience can say that Robert E. Howard's Thurian Age with Call or Howard's Hyborian Age with Conan inspired Tolkien to create Middle-earth. So we covered how it would be impossible for J.R.R. Tolkien to be inspired by Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age when creating Middle-earth. But could Howard's writing have influenced Tolkien while Tolkien was writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? From what I could find, this is very doubtful. From what I could tell from the Tolkien Society's timeline, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings between summer of 1930 and October of 1949. Now keep in mind, there was a World War in between those two dates. World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945. We also have to remember here that on January 11th, 1936, at the age of 30, Robert E. Howard took his own life. His final Conan story, Red Nails, would be published posthumously in Weird Tales in 1936. He would have other posthumous stories published as well in 1936, in 1937, 1938, and 1939 in Weird Tales. And of course, they also reprinted some of his earlier works as well in later issues. But to help determine if Howard's writing inspired Tolkien while Tolkien was writing The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, we have to look at Howard's works that were published in England from 1930 to 1949. Now, during this period, there were a couple attempts to publish Weird Tales magazine in the United Kingdom. The first attempt was 3 issues in 1942. However, after consulting the Collector's Index to Weird Tales, I find that none of them contained any Robert E. Howard stories in them. The second series of Weird Tales in the UK was only 1 issue, and it was published in 1946 and contained no works of Robert E. Howard. The third UK Weird Tales series actually lasted for 28 issues, but that series didn't actually start until 1949, which would have been the same time Tolkien was typing up The Lord of the Rings and making corrections as he went, according to the Tolkien Society timeline. Now, while I was browsing the Science Fiction Encyclopedia website, I discovered that there was a semi-official version of Weird Tales that wasn't actually called Weird Tales. It was an anthology series called Not at Night. This was edited by Christine Campbell Thompson and lasted from 1925 to 1934. It drew largely on Weird Tales stories, according to the Science Fiction Encyclopedia, and it regarded itself as an official British edition of Weird Tales. Again, that's all according to the Science Fiction Encyclopedia website. Robert E. Howard had 3 stories in Not at Night. In 1932, The Black Stone appeared in Not at Night number 8, Grim Death. Now, The Black Stone is a Cthulhu mythos story. A lot of people believe it's the best Cthulhu mythos story not written by H.P. Lovecraft. Even people who aren't fans of the Cthulhu mythos like The Black Stone, but it's not a Hyborian Age story. It's set during the modern 1930s, as it were. Howard was next published in July 1933 in Not at Night number 9, Keep on the Light. This included Howard's Bran MacMorn story, Worms of the Earth. Now, I've heard pulp scholar and 2022 Munsey Award winner Rick Lay mention that Worms of the Earth might be the best story that Robert E. Howard ever wrote. And that's really saying something. And it is a damn good horror story, I'll tell you that much. But it is not a Hyborian Age story. It's set during historical Roman-occupied Britain. I would call it a historical horror yarn. In 1934, in Not at Night number 10, Terror by Night, the Brits finally got a Robert E. Howard Conan story in the forms of Rogues in the House. Rogues in the House is one of the Conan stories where his occupation is a thief, and he gets into more than he bargained for when he breaks into a residence. Now, could Tolkien have read these 3 Robert E. Howard stories that appeared in Not at Night while he was writing The Hobbit and working on Lord of the Rings? Sure, he could. Anything's possible, but even if on the chance that he did actually read these 3 Howard stories, Would they have influenced his own writing? Would it have had that big of an effect on him? I find that very doubtful. I enjoy Professor Tolkien's writing, but I'm not seeing any two-gun Bob in his prose. And I also find a lot of the themes in his work harken back to classical mythology rather than weird fiction. D.M. Ritzlin in his article points out that The Hour of the Dragon was published in the UK as Conan the Conqueror in 1954. This puts us past the period where Tolkien was working on The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But it's pertinent to Ritzlin's article of whether or not J.R.R. Tolkien was a Robert E. Howard fan. Another interesting fact I learned when reading Ritzlin's article was that in July of 1964, now again, Tolkien's long past writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings at this stage, but it's interesting for the question that the article poses. L. Sprague de Camp sent a copy of the anthology titled Swords and Sorcery, which he edited, and which contains Howard's Shadows in the Moonlight, a Conan story, to J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I realize there's a difference between one author enjoying another author's work and one author being influenced by another author. But I think asking if Tolkien really was a Robert E. Howard fan is important to the overall conversation here. I'm not going to read Ritzlin's article word for word. I think everyone should go and read it themselves. I've included a link to the article in the show notes, and while you're there, I highly recommend you check out the DMR Books blog. There's always an interesting article up there. And also check out DMR Books' publications. They've come a heck of a long way from a production standpoint since their first outing, with little paperback-sized books such as the Clifford Ball collection. Now they're doing full-blown trade paperbacks with gorgeous production values. They have a great collection of caveman stories out there and a Viking Adventures collection that I highly recommend. Now, long story short, the notion that Tolkien was a Robert E. Howard fan only has one source, and that source is none other than L. Sprague de Camp, who sent Tolkien the Swords and Sorcery anthology. And as Ritzlin points out in his article, there's no evidence that Tolkien even read the Robert E. Howard story, Shadows in the Moonlight, that was reprinted in this anthology. For more information on that, read Ritzlin's article, because Tolkien did jot down reviews for other stories in that anthology, to include C.L. Moore's story, Hellsguard featuring Gerald of Jory, and a Poul Anderson story, The Valor of Cap'n Vera. Ritzlin's article mentions that de Camp clarified Tolkien enjoying the Conan stories in a letter to John Rateliff. This is important now for the context of what Tolkien said. De Camp indicated, quote, "During our conversation, I said something casual to Tolkien about my involvement with Howard's Conan stories, and he said he rather liked them. That was all. We went on to other subjects. I know he had read Swords and Sorcery because I had sent him a copy. I don't know if he had read any other Conan besides Shadows in the Moonlight, but I rather doubt it." End quote. So there you go. The one source that we have that J.R.R. Tolkien enjoyed the Conan stories only believes that Tolkien read Shadows in the Moonlight and doubts he read anything else. And those of us sitting here in the year 2022 have to wonder if Tolkien even read Shadows in the Moonlight, because he didn't leave behind a review the way he did with the C.L. Moore story and the Poul Anderson story. But it should be noted that the Poul Anderson story is the first story in the collection, and the C.L. Moore story is the second to last story in the collection. Shadows in the Moonlight is the third story in the collection. I would say at this point, in my own personal opinion, just judging by the layout of the table of contents, it's probably 50-50 if Tolkien even read Shadows in the Moonlight. We would really need a Tolkien expert that could speak to how he would read a collection. Would he read the collection in order? Would he skip around the different stories that looked interesting to him? We just don't know. And you also have to wonder, since DeCamp told Tolkien that he was personally involved with the Conan stories, did Tolkien just say he rather enjoyed them just to be polite to DeCamp? Did he just pretend that he had read them? Did he just pretend that he liked them? If only he would have left behind a review of the story, and if only Elsprague DeCamp realized the situation he was in at the time. Having a chance to talk to the giant of modern fantasy about the other giant of modern fantasy, whew, can you imagine? So there you have it. I was unable to find any evidence that J.R.R. Tolkien was inspired by Robert E. Howard, and discovered through D.M. Ritzlin's article that there's doubts that J.R.R. Tolkien even read any of the Conan stories. Again, if there's any Tolkien scholars out there that want to chime in on this, feel free. I just did the best I could because it just felt wrong seeing groundless speculation spread throughout the beast known as the World Wide Web. Pulp Crazy is located at pulpcrazy.com. I'm facebook.com/pulpcrazy, and I'm at pulpcrazy on Twitter and Instagram.